Caribbean. It comes with the landscape, and faced with its beauty, the sigh of history dissolves. Derek Walcott. In 2019, the Caribbean saw the arrival of approximately 26 million foreign visitors. While this figure is a stark decline from the previous year's figures, it's compared favorably to the rest of the world and marked the Caribbean as one of the top international revenue generators in the world of tourism. Despite this, we must accept that this historical period, which will forever be known as the COVID-19 pandemic, has had an obvious impact on the economy. This is undoubtedly significant, but with it, we must also accept that the pandemic has brought to light the capacity of Caribbean people, including those who make a living from the tourism sector, to survive, recover, and grow within a sector that has been forever changed. It is this change, together with the steps which the region must take to secure its continued viability in the tourism sector, that are the focus of our report tonight: Sun, Sand, and Sustainability, the way forward for Caribbean tourism. It's hoped that this report is a useful foundation for the work that will undoubtedly be done by all stakeholders to ensure that when the sigh of history does dissolve on this era, that the beauty of our region continues to surprise and delight. Good evening, everyone. My name is Leanne Levers, and I'm the Director of Advocacy at the Caribbean Policy Research Institute. Thank you for joining us this evening for the launch of our report. As an organization that's dedicated to facilitating the development of evidence-based policy, this report goes directly to the source by collating information from stakeholders from across the region, ranging from funding and government agencies to small and informal hoteliers. To provide greater insight on the report and the topic more generally, we have brought together persons from across the region with a vested interest in the growth and sustainability of the tourism sector. This evening's keynote presenter is Dr. Ishtar Gavayo, our lead researcher for the report, who will share the viewpoints of a range of stakeholders from the sector. Following that, our Executive Director, Dr. Damian King, will moderate the panel discussion, where Dr. Gavayo will be joined by Honorable Dominic Feedy, Minister of Tourism, Information and Broadcasting in Barbados, in St. Lucia, and Mr. Peter Thompson, CEO of Remote Work in Barbados. Before we kick things off, we would like to extend our thanks to the Foreign Commonwealth Development Office, who are funders of this project, and more specifically, to the General Manager of the Country Department Caribbean Group at the FCDO, Mrs. Sharon Babel, who has very kindly agreed to provide some opening remarks. Before handing off to her, I'd like to welcome you again to the launch of our report and hope you find this event to be one that's both informative and engaging.
Thank you, Dr. Levers. This evening's presentation is the third launch of 5 research papers, which the Caribbean Policy Research Institute has produced with the support of the British High Commission in Kingston on the impact of the COVID pandemic on Jamaica and the wider Caribbean. The research being discussed tonight focuses on tourism, perhaps the industry worst affected by the pandemic, but which remains a powerful catalyst for economic growth and development in the region. The overall impact of the crisis is evident in Jamaica and in the wider Caribbean, given the unprecedented losses which have been felt by our tourism development economies. The approach of the study is refreshing, as it not only highlights the fallout from the pandemic, but also presents an in-depth analysis of stakeholder perspectives and focuses on strategies for transformation and building back better in the recovery process. We look forward with great anticipation to the findings that have emerged from the research and the insights which hopefully will help to inform action that will make a positive difference. On behalf of the British High Commission, I wish to thank the lead researcher, the moderator, and panelists who will bring this work to light tonight. and I also look forward to a stimulating discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sharon, and good evening to everybody wherever you are. Tourism is critically important to the Caribbean as a region and to many particular Caribbean economies. So it is of critical importance that we have this discussion to learn the lessons of the pandemic and what it means for what kind of tourism product we should have going forward. We are launching today our report, CAPRI's policy report on sun, sand, and sustainability, the way forward for Caribbean tourism. Dr. Ishtar Gavaya is the lead researcher on this project, and I'm delighted to introduce her to give a presentation that summarizes some of the main findings and recommendations of the report. Ishtar?
Thank you, Damien. Usually, when we think of Caribbean tourism, we think about hotels, cruise ships, and visitors laying on the beach. The reality, though, is that tourism includes a broad range of service providers in both the formal and informal sector. Taxi operators at the ports or bus depots, wedding planners, DJs, and other event personnel who depend heavily on the destination weddings market. Street vendors, port shop fronts, and others whose business directly relies on visitors, such as jewelry vendors at airports or in nearby locales. The tentacles of the sector reach further and into more unexpected places than imagined by most. There are also vegetable, fruit, and poultry suppliers, manufacturers, restaurant and bar suppliers, businesses which primarily serve the accommodation sector. The COVID-19 pandemic has exposed just how far-reaching, pervasive, and complex the Caribbean tourism sector really is, as persons not typically considered part of the tourism sector have been severely impacted during this time. This report brought together voices of key stakeholders in the sector to get a sense of how the pandemic has impacted various groups within the sector and to understand their vision for recovery. The report relied heavily on qualitative rather than quantitative methods. This means that the findings are not based primarily on numbers and statistics, since there are already several publicly available economic, epidemiological, and other quantitative data on the impact of COVID-19 in the Caribbean. Instead, this report focused on the expert insight, experiences, and perspectives of 39 stakeholders representing funding and development agencies, large, small, formal, and informal business operators such as hotels, guest houses and rentals, government agencies, tourism associations, and academics. Although we have some input from stakeholders in Barbados, St. Lucia, Trinidad and Tobago, and other countries, the majority was Jamaica-based. After interviewing these 39 stakeholders, either individually or in focus groups, we contextualize the findings of these interviews with data from other sources. We then use thematic and framework analysis to objectively identify the meat of the matter from all these conversations and all these data. This is what we found. Some stakeholders said that the pandemic increased collaboration and communication within the sector as operators leaned on each other for support. It also appears to have strengthened multi-sectoral collaboration, particularly among tourism, public health, and the media. Initiatives to maintain and strengthen these links, such as the Tourism Linkage Network in Jamaica and the Caribbean Public Health Agency's Caribbean Tourism and Health Program, were also mentioned by interviewees. Since completion and circulation of the report to a small group of stakeholders, we've also seen commendable initiatives, including a series of consultations underway in Jamaica to address supply chain gaps. Nevertheless, stakeholders spoke to long-standing barriers to collaboration within the sector. There appeared to be deep mistrust among various stakeholder groups, fueled by a lack of effective communication, transparency, and understanding of one another's priorities. For example, micro, small, and medium-scale operators in the sector shared that from their perspective, business development support agencies are often disconnected from their needs and limitations, even though they are who these agencies are meant to be targeting. Operators also express that they are usually unaware of or unconvinced about the opportunities available from such agencies. More importantly, stakeholders found the application procedures required to receive business development support and assistance to be bureaucratic and even prohibitive and unfair to small businesses. Consequently, we found that while resources and funding for micro, small, and medium enterprises, also referred to as MSMEs, are available, they are sometimes left untapped because they are not accessible to those who need it most. Stakeholders perceive serious inequity within the sector, where large and foreign-owned entities are favored over smaller, local ones, despite the fact that local MSMEs make up most of the sector. Interviewees called for MSMEs and informal operators to be better recognized and represented in order to address their exclusion from important policy decisions which seem to happen at a higher level with the input of larger or foreign-owned entities. This need for representation of the smaller, more diverse sector players was seen as urgent during the pandemic, when decisions affecting the survival and operation of these groups often occur without their input. There were also calls to pursue more equitable arrangements with cruise ship operators, which was a key concern for some stakeholders who questioned government's pursuits of these partnerships, despite a low return on investment and the damaging environmental impact of the ships. Overall, all groups called for stronger regional efforts to address barriers and reduce inequity and help future-proof our economies against similar sector shocks. COVID also forced stakeholders to more seriously consider the long-term sustainability of the sector. Operators spoke very creatively and knowledgeably about how major diversification of the Caribbean tourism product is necessary. They shared their own efforts to diversify their tourism products, and that there is a need to target a more diverse visitor as traveler profiles, behaviors, and tastes continue to evolve. As one stakeholder put it, visitors we have are getting older and older because we have repeat guests that keep coming here. Well, what we need to do is try to sell to younger people. Stakeholders suggested packaging the Caribbean tourism product in a more modern, diverse, and appealing way to sell to younger travelers, older travelers, and everyone in between. They talked about developing and promoting cannabis tourism, medical tourism, yachting tourism, education, athletic, and intra-regional or domestic tourism, among many others, as viable, scalable areas for growth. While there's already some activity in these areas, stakeholders felt that it was nowhere at the scale it could be to help build a more resilient and competitive Caribbean regional sector. They found that this in part was due to legislative and funding barriers to implementation of these ideas, and they pointed out that success of these initiatives would depend on an evolved government approach to the sector. Again, since completion and preliminary circulation of the report, we've seen in Jamaica the announcement of a creative tourism alternative financing product. It will be interesting to see how these kinds of initiatives adapt and progress as the sector continues to navigate the pandemic and chart a way forward. Policymakers have been calling for more practical, sustainable energy and food practices in the sector. And it was impressive to hear that operators are already embracing these. Persons in Barbados, for example, shared that they have long used solar panels in their operations. While in Jamaica, hoteliers report purchasing as much as 90% of their foodstuffs from local suppliers. Yet, they pointed out a need for better public-private partnership to address high energy costs across the region, which some share is stifling the growth of the sector. Others implied a need for more supportive government regulatory frameworks to increase access to alternative and renewable energy equipment. The experiences of stakeholders during COVID revealed a clear need for more adequate and extensive social safety nets and mental health support for workers in this sector. We know that the pandemic had a severe impact on regional employment and underemployment rates. The financial blow to informal sector workers, many of whom work part-time, was also unprecedented, as they were often not eligible for government relief packages. Policymakers in Jamaica share the Tourism Workers Pension Plan currently in progress, which targets those without formal access to a pension scheme. When it is rolled out, it will be important to collect data on its usefulness for modeling similar schemes to help fill these gaps. We also found that while mental health support was sometimes available to those working in large hotels in the formal sector, it was often unavailable to casual workers or those in MSMEs. Some operators call for more widespread attention to the mental health of workers in response to what many have experienced during this pandemic. They also call for stronger, more practical mentorship schemes to help empower MSME operators to successfully manage business challenges that may affect well-being. Stakeholders' insights on the inequity between large foreign-owned entities and local MSMEs in the formalization process for accessing available supports suggest that more assistance is needed. We recommend that governments pilot an incubation period for new MSMEs started by sole traders and partnerships. During this period, they can have lowered tiered compliance requirements, which can graduate to stronger tiers. Stakeholders were insistent on their calls for stronger regional collaboration to improve competitiveness and attractiveness as a top global destination. We recommend that the Caribbean Tourism Organization and Caribbean Hotel and Tourism Association, advised by CARICOM, deploy a regional digital marketing campaign. The campaign can highlight individual islands' unique socio-cultural attractions to help target more diverse travelers. It can use islands' pooled resources for the planning, design, and rollout. This report called for better communication and transparency between stakeholders. We recommend that national business development agencies undertake a needs assessment targeting MSMEs that do not yet earn a profit with staff of 20 or fewer persons. This can help gauge their most commonly requested skills training and capacity building tools. Agencies can enroll volunteer mentors from the larger business community with a time commitment of a minimum of 6 months to a maximum of 1 year to help meet the support and/or training needs. Some stakeholders reminded us of the sobering data which exists that make it clear that something like the pandemic will absolutely happen again. They also highlighted the increasing global integration of security, travel, and public health, and how climate change affects this and vice versa. We therefore recommend that CARFA name a climate advisor to advise the tourism sector on public health challenges and strategies in relation to climate change and natural disasters. Some stakeholders expressed concern and bewilderment that the sector is not more of a high-profile, high-action policy issue on the CARICOM level. An emerging recommendation is that the Council for Finance and Planning, COFAP, appoint a board of experts in research, sustainability, and climate change to develop grant proposals for large-scale project funding. This can help offset regional costs of moving toward alternative energy sources or toward building more sustainable community-based attractions. For example, government-owned eco-resorts across the region. Data sharing and ideas around what kind of data are needed were crucial concerns stakeholders highlighted, especially the need for stronger, more transparent, and standardized data. We recommend that CARICOM representatives, as informed by Ministries of Health, Tourism, and National Security, appoint a commission to develop a regional standardized travel form which collects pertinent health, travel, and security data. This can be integrated with or adopted by the Advanced Passenger Information System, or APIS, of the CARICOM Implementation Agency for Crime and Security, or CARICOM Impacts. Thank you for your attention, and we look forward to this rich discussion on today's report launch.
Okay, thank you very much, Ishtar. You've raised some critical issues. So we're going to invite Peter Thompson, who is the CEO of Remote Work Barbados, to give us his initial thoughts on the report and on Ishtar's presentation. Peter, welcome.
Demian, and thank you, Ishtar, for your report. It mirrors our experience in Barbados to a very considerable degree. What distinguishes Barbados, however, is the light at the end of the tunnel. Barbados has innovated, diversifying not only our tourism product, but our base market for tourism by attracting remote workers, long-term visitors who stay for up to a year and even renew after a year. There are criteria which make them eligible, most of all that they need to be earning $50,000 per year. And this, of course, gives them the capacity to contribute quite mightily to the local economy. But what I want to emphasize is that this achieves a number of the diversifications of tourism product that the report aims at, because this demographic, first of all, they're younger. 25 to 35 is the median. Also, they are somewhat psychographically different from the conventional tourist in ways which make them much more enthusiastic about experiencing the life of the country rather than staying in a tourist bubble. And this, of course, has the effect of spreading their spending far beyond the usual hotel and restaurant expenses. Thirdly, it is clear, to me at least, that encouraging longer-term tourism, essentially at the other end of the spectrum from cruise tourism, where large government investments have had very dubious returns. The Barbados government has invested next to zero in their long-term remote work visitor experience. But, well, what happened in March 2020 was that, of course, our tourism industry fell off the cliff. It collapsed by 96% for the remainder of 2020. But that part of the accommodation industry, which pivoted to cater to long-term remote work visitors, they went on to a record year, both in profits and revenue. So we can clearly see a signpost which gives us very great optimism that we can rebuild our tourism industry by focusing on the changes that COVID has made to the economies of countries from which our tourists come.
Thank you very much, Peter. You know, the issue, I mean, there's a lot to unpack here. So let's see if we can go through it in some kind of systematic way. One of the critical issues that Ishtar, you raised in your report, really at the beginning, is to create an appreciation. What your qualitative research did was to create an appreciation for how far the tentacles of tourism reaches. And entirely by coincidence, there was a front page article in Jamaica's newspaper 2 days ago that was making the same point about the entertainment industry. It was making the point that even though all of the activities of the small businesses and the informal, players in the industry, each of the individual activities are small, but when you aggregate it, it's a significant part of the sector and the activity. And it's the same point about the creative industries. Somebody made a comment in the chat. It's the same point about entertainment and the same point about tourism. So it really speaks to the importance of what we're addressing here. Have I gotten that right, Ishtar?
Yes, you have, Damien. And I know as an economist, you can probably speak much more lucidly on the direct versus the indirect costs of the sector and the direct versus indirect contributions of the sector to overall GDP, etc. So I will leave that part of the conversation to you. But what we have seen with this report and from engaging with the stakeholders is that there is an underrepresentation of the stakeholders in this sector that are informal. These are stakeholders that before COVID perhaps were not in the picture as clearly in terms of the dialogues nationally and regionally, but we've realized just how much they're affected. And we've realized the diversity within the sector. There are so many players that are not traditionally counted. And this issue of being counted, this issue of measurement, this issue of data is something that we wanted to highlight in the report, because without being seen, without being counted, they run the risk of being seen as not direct contributors to the sector.
Thank you. One of the questions that has come in already on Slido, we are using slido.com as the platform to field questions from all the viewers. You go to slido.com and put in the event code CAPRI. And one questioner is asking that, the report is calling attention to the informal participants in the industry not having a fair hearing and not having sufficient access to the tourist dollar. And the question is that to the extent that, the informal participants are trying to avoid taxes, then Peter, I hope you can take this. How is it they have a claim to wanting to be represented and to getting a bigger share of the tourist dollar?
That's a good question, Damien. The fact is that as technology changes and more of our transactions are non-cash transactions, the informal sector not only needs to be recognized, but they need access to the electronic literacy and tools so that when they do a small transaction, they can complete that transaction with the tools that the visitors are accustomed to using. So they need to be able to take a card of any sort. And that is the way that both their needs for expanded income and the rest of society's and the government's needs to bring them into formal participation in the economy, I think that is the way that it can be achieved. Because yes, they do need to survive, which means they need to access higher volumes of business. But then with those higher volumes comes the higher responsibility.
One of the things that the report brought out was the many different ways in which the smaller participants in tourism get sidelined. And we ran into a gentleman who works at a beach club that is not connected to any of the big hotels. And this is what he had to say about why is it they don't get as much tourists as they otherwise might.
The people in the hotel, they told not to come outside because it's dangerous outside, and me I tell him, say, no, it's not dangerous out here. Right? And he must say, yeah, I love to be around the local, but they told us that we mustn't go around the local people. Now, so nothing like that, man. Walking over, we love it.
So a part of the problem is that the industry is structured in all of the islands to be advantageous to the larger players. But here we have a dimension now where the hotels are discouraging the guests from spending outside of the hotels. I mean, Ishtar, what can we do about that if the hotels themselves are part of the obstacle?
I think it's important to keep in mind that there are different types of players again. So we're not with the report, and I don't think any of our stakeholders are trying to apply this broad brush and say the larger hotels are just doing a disservice to the overall sector, or that the smaller hotels really should be the only one that are prioritized, or the smaller vendors or the informal vendors. What the report is really highlighting is that the inequity needs to be acknowledged and the inequity needs to be addressed. So in terms of what that gentleman was saying, perhaps within the business model of that larger hotel, which may be an all-inclusive, it is important for them to sustain their business model. Their business model is based on keeping those guests in that space. However, there are other ways of doing business and other business models in terms of some smaller inns, hotels, guest houses, even the Airbnb industry, which we've seen to be very resilient during the pandemic. They offer models that we can look at in terms of engaging with the community. And it's more of those that we're seeing a lot of support for. Even in terms of the ecosystem, we're seeing more calls from players at all levels to have a deeper type of community-based tourism product.
There is indeed a push towards that deeper type of product, but what we're here talking about is really the breadth of the obstacles and the multiplicity of obstacles that actually fight against that. Here's another conversation that we had that highlighted this problem of how the tourists getting more involved in the whole of the country, you know, in the community gets more difficult. He's talking about
country one road, so development, and anyway development they crash some business, but only the poor and the vulnerable, very real poor always feel it when there's an highway, when there's development in the country.
So he's talking about how highways and road improvements bypasses the community and bypasses the small tourist service providers. And I mean, the man had a mature attitude to it, you know. He said, listen, you know, we need development, we need roads, but it basically keeps the tourists away. So the central question raised by this research, and I'm coming back to you again, Ishtar, the central question raised is we need to broaden and deepen the tourist experience. That is going to make it more resilient, given the multiplicity of obstacles. You know, is there a realistic hope that is going to happen? And even beyond those recommendations, how?
It's a really important question, Damien. How is it going to happen? The stakeholders that we spoke to really called for a top-down need for changes. So at the regional level, at CARICOM level, we need to see some action. We need to see some support, and we need to see working on regulatory structures, working on financing that will facilitate building communities. From the bottom up, we're seeing a lot of agitation, a lot of advocacy, a lot of people trying to get into the conversation. And so what needs to happen again is not just an acknowledgement that these voices have been excluded from the conversation, but what are the mechanisms for actually including them in the conversation? For one example, there is a lot of funding often available through development agencies. And this funding is meant to target micro, small, and medium enterprises. However, many of the micro, small, but particularly micro and small enterprises aren't even aware of these funding opportunities, these financing opportunities, these opportunities for capacity strengthening and mentoring, because they don't plug into the same networks. The ways that the networks are set up actually need to be transformed. And again, for them to be transformed, we need to get these voices in the room, because traditionally these voices are not in the room when the policies are being made and when the procedures are being hashed out. So there needs to be not just the lip service, really, that these players are important, but efforts to actually get them in the conversation. For example, the Airbnb owners and the operators in Jamaica spoke about not even being aware of some of the financing and COVID supports that were in place because they're not officially part of the Jamaica Hotel and Tourism Association. So they had to develop their own support strategies. For example, a WhatsApp group that served as their de facto association. So we need to figure out who is not in the conversation, and this is what this report was meant to illustrate, and how. So we were now putting the onus on the stakeholders at all levels to ensure that there is this connection.
So that's a critical takeaway from the report and the discussion, that the problem starts with not having a sufficient variety of voices representing the entire industry. So we're going to put that as sort of one of our key takeaways and themes that we're going to carry through this discussion. But the same question, which is, how do we get more of the community, involved in tourism? And it's useful that we have Peter here, because Barbados was world leading in actually finding a way to do that. Peter.
Yes, indeed. And I do have to give the government a lot of credit for leading the world. They went from an idea that I sent to them through legislation to policy in 12 weeks, which is some sort of world record. What we've discovered here, and I'm glad that Ishtar brought up the Airbnb sector, because of course they're small, they're agile, they pivot faster, but they point the way for the rest of us. And the fact is that COVID has changed the industry and the world permanently. It is not that after COVID, remote work is going to go away. And so we need, as a Caribbean, to continue to lead the development of this, because it makes it a lot easier to solve the sort of problems of getting the right people in the room, because the tastes and the patterns of behavior of remote work visitors puts them wanting to get into all the back roads and the community, because they have the time to do so. And yes, of course, they come to drink rum punches on the beach, but after 3 weeks, that gets old. Mm-hmm. They really want an experience rooted in authenticity.
Damien, can I jump in to respond to something Peter was just saying? I think that type of agile response from the government is so commendable. And it's the type of responsiveness that so many of the stakeholders that are parts of regional development agencies, regional financing and funding agencies that they spoke about too. Unfortunately, sometimes it's the exception rather than the rule. Even though we saw this expediting of certain types of procedures, processes, even legislation in this COVID period, we've also seen that other things are lagging behind. Some of these things include the bureaucratic processes still in place for not just accessing supports, but sometimes even registration. Stakeholders spoke about the time that they need to be spending in offices. Stakeholders at the regional level spoke about the ways in which our digital infrastructure is not strong enough. And they also spoke about the need to ensure that we're thinking, as your entity shows, Peter, we're thinking of diversity within diversity. So for example, your company, which focuses on remote work, people may have thought of that with a broad brush at first in terms of just digital nomads. What your company has managed to do is to show that there's a distinct other type of digital worker, what you've referred to as these expat workers. and that's a differentiation from somebody who is dipping in and coming back out. And it's that type of legislation and regulation, that type of support structure needs to happen at the regional level and at the national level in terms of things like, for example, immigration laws. And so it's really important that we think about how can we do these things in an agile way. If we're really saying that we're responding, how can it be done in an agile manner?
You know, it occurred to me as I was reading this report that many of the strategies for having a more resilient tourism sector would work against the current approach we have in all the islands, which is the mass tourism model of trying to get as many people here as much as possible and to lock them up in large hotels. And so I wondered how people would feel about the trade-off between having a larger tourist sector or having a more resilient tourist sector. And so we went out yesterday and we did a poll to ask people if they had to make a choice between a tourism sector that was more prosperous and a smaller sector, but that was more resilient and therefore less susceptible to these ups and downs. And this is what we found. Now this comes as a surprise to me, that people would really rather support the kinds of recommendations and the kind of direction for tourism that we were talking about here, by more than 3 to 1, almost 4 to 1. Peter, does that surprise you?
It doesn't surprise me as an opinion of the general population. It is not, however, the opinion of that part of the population that has access to lots of capital. And that's where the discontinuity arises. I think as public policy, I don't think it is even necessary to make that trade-off, because as Ishtar was pointing out, we count the wrong things. We should not be counting, bodies getting off the boat at the port for a couple of hours. It's pointless. Mm-hmm. It's a waste of everybody's time. We need to be coherently evaluating the economic impact, not making up numbers. And we need to understand that the economic impact of a long-term visitor is way more profound than the economic impact of a short-term visit. A visitor has two resources to spend: time and money. When we only have visitors who are using scarce vacation time to blow a lot of money very suddenly that they've spent all year saving up, we are making a very poor use of that human being as a resource for our economy. When they come here and they're earning and they're doing all the things that they do because they're making their home here for a year, the economic impact that they leave behind is far greater.
Indeed it is. I want to get back, if I might, Ishtar, to the point you made earlier in the discussion about the importance of getting a more diverse set of voices in the room. A part of the research for this study looked at what are the interests of the different sets of voices and the extent to which their interests overlapped. And I think that is critical to the importance of why there have to be different voices. So I wonder if you just elaborate on that for the audience.
Sure. what we found when we spoke to operators, for example, is that they really had to be struggling with, and are still struggling, truthfully, with their business survival. That's a different type of struggle than a larger entity. So some of the larger entities have certain types of mechanisms built in, for example, membership fees that enable them to still manage even during a serious crisis as a pandemic. So their priorities are survival. They have that in common, but it's different things that survival is really focusing on. There were similarities too in terms of goals coming out of the pandemic. There was a commonality in terms of almost an expectation that the vaccinations was going to erase or to really minimize the challenge that the pandemic has presented to the region, and that there would be a very quick startup. And those types of conceptualizations of the issue, the role that the pandemic is playing in both the medium and the longer term economic impact on the region, those were very distinct from what the regional entities, such as the government agencies, regional financing and development agencies, what they understood, because they saw this pandemic as actually having much longer term effects and much longer term shocks and aftershocks. So there are similarities in terms of goals. There are similarities in terms of priorities, and particularly survival as a key priority now. There are also similarities in terms of thinking about strategies, but there are differences as well in terms of framing of the issue, and definitely in terms of the challenges to actually what it means to survive. And so, for example, we spoke with one operator in Jamaica who spoke so eloquently about this surge of cancellation after cancellation after cancellation after cancellation, and what that did to her morale, and what it did to her psyche in terms of thinking about the small staff that that relied on her extensively for their livelihood. That's a different type of concern and consideration when you're thinking of a much, much larger entity. Yes, there is a sense of needing to provide for persons, but there might be more resources that those larger entities can actually draw from. And so the flavor, the texture of what surviving, of what a challenge, of what a bureaucratic procedure means to an operator, and the diversity of those perspectives, the jerk chicken man, the jewelry vendor in the craft market versus the restaurant operator, all of those perspectives need to be included in the conversation about what is really necessary.
I think perhaps the recommendation that is likely to be the most problematic of the ones you listed is your call for a regional digital marketing campaign. So I want to give you a few seconds to address it, to explain it, and then I'd like Peter to come in and say what the challenge is going to be with having a regional One Caribbean campaign. Ishtar,
well,
first.
Sure. This was a recommendation that, believe it or not, we heard from all level of stakeholder. And we thought it was really important to highlight. And what it means is that each country, each nation's uniqueness is not going to be drowned out, even though we have this combined approach. What it means is that each island, each country, each nation needs to really clarify what its product is and how the diverse dimensions of that product, what its target market is, and then really seek to bring that in. But particularly in the context of the pandemic and the aftershocks of this pandemic, which will last for a while, it's really important that the Caribbean comes out strong as a region, as a unified entity. Because if there is not that strength in numbers, we heard, for example, from some representatives that it's really hard even to get a voice at the table when it comes to vaccination, sometimes in a global context at some of these larger global meetings. And so that power in numbers is what this recommendation is really speaking to.
Okay, so and the reason I want Peter to I mean, I'm not telling your opinion, but the reason I wanted to challenge that is that one of the questioners on Slido is really wondering whether, you know, the different Caribbean islands are going to go along with minimizing their competitiveness. I think you're muted.
Well, I understand their skepticism, but that skepticism is all rooted not in economics, but in politics. Our experience here in Barbados is that there is considerable appetite for people who are here for a year to want to explore other islands. They want to go to Dominica. It's completely different from Barbados. They want to go sailing. Well, the Grenadines is the place for that. And so, because their time frames are different, there is the opportunity to build product which we never had before. For example, one of the drawbacks has always been the high cost of inter-island airfare. The fact is that when you have to get there in 90 minutes, flying is the only way to go. But you can get on a catamaran and overnight you can be in St. Lucia from Barbados. And of course, the cost of that is an order of magnitude lower. And when you have a year to spend, why not? It's an adventure. And so if regional governments have the courage and the sophistication to understand that they can do way, way better by collaborating than by competing, because they're not all offering the same product, then Ishtar's recommendation can go very far.
So we need to wrap. Let me try to summarize the major takeaways. It's difficult to do that because it's a complex report, covers a lot of issues. But what the pandemic has taught us, now that we have seen how deep it reaches, how far it reaches the tourism sector, is that we need a more resilient tourist product. And one way to get to that is to broaden the tourist product, to have it have more dimensions than we do now, moving away from, you know, the focus on sun, sand, and sea. And in order to get to that, we need longer stay visitors who are going to do more not only within different islands, but across the islands. And the actions really belong with the government. The government is the one who has to create a path for small, informal players to be able to access the financing, to be able to improve their services, to ready themselves to participate more. The government is the one who has to make sure those voices are in the room, because those voices represent different interests. In a minute each, is that fair? And is there any other element you want to add as a takeaway? First Peter and then Ishtar.
Thank you, Damien. That is a fair summary of a complex and quite comprehensive report. The key thing that we need to understand from the point of view of governments is, of course, that what they fear is expenditure. But there are many, many things that they can do, hardly expending a cent. It does not cost any money to invent a new type of visa. It costs zero. It does not cost any money to coordinate your exit and entry plans and create bubbles between islands that are appropriate for our public health. It does not cost money to experiment, because the key to agility is the willingness to try something new. And so I think that Ishtar has pointed toward very, very profound ways of enhancing the sustainability of the sector. But the political and socioeconomic challenges of de-emphasizing high capital investment in mega projects that are probably all-inclusive, it's a decision we have to make, but we have to move our tourism industry away from that model for it to be sustainable.
Thank you.
Yes.
Ishtar.
Yeah, I completely agree with what you've said, Damien, in terms of the key takeaways and what Peter has reiterated. And what I also want to add in terms of key messages is that we need to leverage the agility that has been demonstrated during this period, because there have been master plans that were on the books for years that were not actually implemented until this pandemic came about, and some of the recommendations that were on the books for years suddenly, speedily were able to move towards action. So let's leverage that agility that has been demonstrated in this period. Let us also foster trust, and you foster trust by actually genuinely including persons and entities in conversations. It's crucial that this is genuinely done, and that there is, as we would say in Jamaica, backative for that you demonstrate that with your actions. And the third thing is that to facilitate this trust, we need to share data. We need to generate data. We need to be very clear about what we are measuring. And then we also need to share those data, particularly in terms of thinking about leveraging the power that we have as a region and our strength as a region for tourism.
Thank you very much, Peter from Barbados, and especially thanks to you, Ishtar, for staying up. It's quite late in the UK, so really appreciate that. And to send us out, we hand over back to our host for the evening, Dr. Leanne Levers.
Thank you, Damien. So we sincerely hope that this report and tonight's discussion will engender greater collaboration and innovation, as well as consideration of key issues mentioned within the report, such as climate change and public health for the tourism sector. We're grateful to all of our participants this evening, especially our lead researcher, Dr. Gavayo, and our panelist, Mr. Thompson. Our report, Sun, Sand, and Sustainability, The Way Forward for Caribbean Tourism, is now available for download at our website, www.capricaribbean.org. And our next report launch will be on July 8th, and it will be focusing on quarantine communities, where we look at the impact of COVID-19 on deprived communities. So look forward to watching that, and have a good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us again.